Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our in-house guests, we always ask that last courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. Thank you especially, Brett, for being up here on stage with it. And for those watching online, you're always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Welcoming our guest and leading our discussion is Brett Shafer, who serves as the J. Kingham Senior Research Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs, part of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He analyzes a wide range of foreign policy issues, focusing primarily on the United Nations and affiliated funds and programs, and frequently speaks and publishes on these issues to both international and domestic audiences. He edited in 2009 the book Conundrum, which is the limits of the United Nations and the search for alternatives. He joined us in 1995, and from March 2003 to March 2004, he worked at the Pentagon as an assistant for international criminal court policy. Please join me in welcoming Brett Shafer. Brett?
It's funny. John mentioned Conundrum. In Conundrum, we had a book about, or we had a chapter rather, talking about United Nations human rights mechanisms and the flaws of those mechanisms and really embracing and advancing fundamental human rights and freedoms. And we did so in what I now recognize as a fairly fundamental way, because the book that we're talking about today by Mr. Rhodes, The Debasement of Human Rights and How Politics Sabotage the Ideal of Freedom, is sort of the master's thesis to what we began or what we talked about in that chapter. Well, maybe a PhD. We'll just go ahead and give the dissertation level. But Mr. Rhodes, for those of you who don't know, is an international human rights advocate. He's been in this field for decades. He's traveled abroad, he's spoken, he's worked in the field to try and advance human rights everywhere from the former Soviet Union to Eastern Europe to Africa to Latin America and Cuba, Iran, you name it, where there's been human rights deficits. He's been there to try and point out and guide the way to fixing those problems. And this book is I think, an overdue discussion about how the notion of human rights has traveled so far away from the original concept outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's traveled from what we all recognize as basic fundamental human rights and freedoms in terms of expression, freedom of expression, the right to due process, individual liberties, into something that is very different today. Talking about economic, social, and cultural rights, the right to food, the right to water, essentially guarantees that governments can provide, but getting away from the original concept of where human rights came from. And without any further ado, I'd like just to give the floor to Mr. Rhodes to talk about his book and to talk about how this evolution in the concept of human rights has become harmful for the very concept, and actually harmful to people who still lack those basic rights and freedoms around the world today. Thank you very much for coming here, Mr. Rhodes.
Thank you, Brett. I've known Brett for a number of years, and I've never seen him here in Washington. It's always been in the belly of the beast in Human Rights Council. The theme of my book is that human rights are based on natural rights. The idea of human rights is the idea that humans, in a state of nature, possess basic liberties, and that they need these liberties to fulfill themselves as individuals. Economic and social rights have introduced a political dimension into human rights. And there's a difference between human rights and politics. Politics are about dividing the pie. They're about compromise. And they're about gradual development. And human rights are about liberties. They're about freedoms. And I don't want this book to be seen as a political attack on welfare states or even on socialism, democratic socialism. I think that, in fact, it's possible for democratic socialist states to have human rights. I don't agree with democratic socialism, by the way, but I enjoy democratic socialism. I live in Germany, which has a very, very strong social welfare system. But this represents a consensus of the German population. They want to, they don't complain about paying a lot of taxes. They want to pay more taxes because they want to be a good society. They think that they want to help everyone. And my wife and I'll just tell you personally that we have benefited from this. We have a handicapped child, and it's incredible the benefits that we are entitled to as a result. And so I don't want to sound like a hypocrite. But today I just, and I'm very happy to see you and to have this small group to talk to about my book. You know, I want to talk to you a little bit about my perspective on human rights, you know, which comes out of my work. Fortunately, I have had experience in human rights which preceded my intellectual work, so that I approached the concept of human rights based with some experience behind me rather than the other way around. And I think a lot of people approach human rights from a kind of a textbook point of view, and then this distorts their idea of reality. I feel my approach is based on a kind of understanding of reality. And this is the first thing I want to talk about. Then I want to talk a little bit about the way that the international human rights system, and it's not just the UN, it's also regional human rights treaties, have seen a kind of proliferation of economic and social rights, which are crowding out basic civil and political rights, and relegating them to a kind of small corner of the human rights activity. And then the fourth point is it's even worse, that we now have a situation where human rights are used as a pretext for violating human rights. So that human rights has become an opponent of human rights or an opponent of natural rights. And maybe that's the clearer way to say this, that the concept of human rights today includes natural rights and civil and economic and social rights, but the combination of them is working against the enjoyment of basic freedoms, of our natural rights. And so, like Brett said, I've been involved in human rights in a lot of different countries, but mainly my main experience has been as the executive director of the International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights, which was an organization composed mainly of dissidents from the Soviet and East European human rights community. It was founded in 1982, and I took over the organization in 1993, after the fall of the communist countries, of course. And but still, the organization was made up mainly of people who had been confronting the totalitarian state, and so my perspective on human rights was very much influenced by them. But you know, I have a very vivid memory now of an occasion in Vienna when the European Fundamental Rights Agency was being formed. And by the way, the European Fundamental Rights Agency is a complete farce. It's a waste of money, and it doesn't protect any human rights, and they don't even have the right to set their own agenda. the Council of Ministers of the EU sets the agenda for a human rights monitoring, institution. And if that were taking place in a country like Moldova, they would scream. But anyway, I'm getting off the track here. And so they were forming the Fundamental Rights Agency, and they invited some NGOs to come and to talk about what they wanted them to take up. And so I went with some of my colleagues, and we wanted to talk about torture, because there is torture in European prisons. There's torture in prisons in basically every country in the world, I think. I would be very surprised. We wanted to talk about freedom of expression, and we wanted to talk about issues like that. But then there was a crowd of people there who wanted to talk about rent control. And they sort of pushed us aside. And I was thinking, what the hell is going on here? What about the priorities? What's important here and what isn't important? And I'm not saying that rent control isn't important, but I question if we have to defend the idea that the freedom of torture is more important than rent control. And this is the problem for the human rights community today, that with the expansive definition of human rights that has been embraced by the international community, there's no basis for making any rational choice between what is and what is not a human right. And you can see this in the development of the international human rights. We have more and more human rights. Second of all, there's no ability to make priorities. So we are told that all human rights are equal. And therefore, we don't have a case for saying that the right to be free from torture is more important than the right for rent control. The European Union, in its Fundamental Rights Charter, says that which includes 50 provisions. It's one of the biggest human rights charters in the world, and they said, well, we want to have it. We want to have everything there, and it's even they even imply that they could add some rights as it goes. It's a kind of a flexible document. But they say that there's a human right to so-called free employment counseling. And I have raised that question publicly with the EU, the European Union Human Rights Commissioner, in a big meeting of NGOs in Brussels a few years ago, and the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights. And they just got very uptight and kind of dismissed it and said, well, we support all human rights, like I don't. And then there was a kind of chill came over the room, and then people thought that I was some sort of kamikaze, which is true. And so, but the third problem, as a human rights defender dealing with the concept of human rights in its debased form today is the legitimation of oppression. That human rights are economic and social rights are the rights that dictators love, and the bad guys have appropriated the concept of human rights. And so when Brett and I have been watching these universal periodic reviews, which is a kind of a test of states. This is kind of exam how they have fulfilled their human rights obligations. Even North Korea is bragging about their human rights. They say, well, we have free healthcare and education and this and that. And people say, yes, that's right. And so, I think 30 or 40 countries commented at the Universal Periodic Review of North Korea that, yes, they congratulated them on their fulfillment of economic and social rights. And so the impression that you get from this is, well, it's kind of a mixed picture. Yeah, they do have some problems with, like gulag camps and, burning political prisoners alive. But, and there's this but, they look at their social system. and so, they're coming along. This is what they would say, and this is serious. This is a kind of a serious flaw in the system today, which is creating moral equivalency and a degradation of the idea of human rights. I worked in human rights in the Helsinki Federation with Yuri Orlov for many years. He's still alive, and he was one of the founders of the Moscow Helsinki group, a physicist. And one of the things that he told me that I'll always remember, and he said that human rights are not about what, they're about how. Human rights are not about our social goals, they're about how we achieve them. And unfortunately, human rights is today associated with social justice, social goals, with politics. And this is contrary to the way the Soviet dissidents and other human rights activists during the period of communism approached human rights. And there's a section in the book in which I discuss the human rights concept of these dissidents. And there's several things that appear very prominently when you look at this. And in fact, the literature on this is missing because there's lots of histories. There are a number of good histories of the dissident movement. But what did they really think about human rights? How did they see human rights? And they didn't articulate very clearly a vision of human rights. But one of the prominent aspects, what they did do is they said, this is not politics. And they weren't interested in having political activists in their groups. And they didn't want to be seen as a political opposition group. In fact, the Moscow Helsinki group saw itself as assisting the Soviet government to fulfill its human rights obligations. And I think this is a very healthy way for human rights groups to approach their relationship with their governments from a nonpartisan point of view, from an independent point of view, and to assist the government to provide objective information, because a government isn't very good at monitoring itself. Independent civil society is absolutely essential to human rights activism. And this is another point about the dissident movements, is that they had a very scientific approach to human rights. They were looking for facts. And the reason is, where this came from, most of them were like intellectuals and scientists, natural scientists, like Orlov, who's a physicist, but Lyudmila Alexeyeva also is a historian. She's trained to understand facts. Unfortunately, facts are in bad repute today. Nobody believes in facts anymore. With this kind of postmodern approach to truth, everything depends on where you're coming from, and there's no real truth, and we're just, lost in a kind of mush that we're based on our own interests. I talk in this book about the problem that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights included economic and social rights, and this is seen as a kind of compromise, a political compromise. This is true, and the document was used to solve a political problem, the problem of integrating the totalitarian states within the UN system, a moral integration of totalitarianism into the UN system. So to call economic and social rights human rights was a way of, it was appeasement, but it served this geopolitical purpose of integration and solidarity. They didn't want them outside. And maybe from a political point of view, there's some, virtue in this. but it's kind of sacrificing the idea of human rights on the altar of global politics. And it's, you know, when you look really into the history of this document, you see this geopolitical aspect, but you also see the influence of the progressive political parties, which were ascendant at the end of World War II, and assumptions that, you know, the role of the state was to solve problems, and that freedom is only possible when the state does that. So freedom is conditioned on welfare. And so this is a kind of gradual understanding that built up, and really the main engine of this was the Roosevelt administration. And even though the United States doesn't have a reputation of supporting economic and social rights, really the United States has been responsible largely for their presence in the international system. And I talk about this in a chapter about the history of natural rights in America. And I say that even though our country, and I'm a very patriotic American, by the way, I have a European passport, but I live in Europe, but you know, maybe that's why I'm so patriotic, because I see it from afar, and to me, America is still a beautiful idea. But natural rights were the foundation of our country. This is what gave the colonists their idea, their courage, their moral courage, to go out so far on a limb and to risk everything for freedom. And gradually, this commitment to natural rights, you know, decayed in the 19th century. People had freedom, and they didn't worry too much about with the idea of freedom. So when you have it, you don't love it so much as when you don't have it, which is something that Plato said, by the way. And the only American administration to promote the notion of natural rights in the international system has been the Reagan administration. And I consider this an extremely healthy thing to bring this debate about natural rights into international politics, but you don't find it today. Another big kind of threshold event in the development of international human rights was the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, which I attended parts of. And there we have this notion, you know, this is where the progressives, who were, you know, extremely excited at that point, pushed the notion of economic and social rights very hard, because these rights were no longer associated with totalitarianism. And so, you know, paradoxically, the death of communism resulted in a great rebirth of socialistic ideas coming into human rights. And the meeting resulted in emphasizing a principle which had been around since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the idea of the indivisibility of human rights. And this is really a front for pushing economic and social rights. But it's sort of, and it's an idea that, by the way, makes absolutely no sense. And legal scholars say, you know, like James Nichol, who have really said, well, are these rights indivisible? No, they're not. Some are. Some go together, but some don't have any relationship to each other. And but this was saying what this really says, and I'll read what I wrote here in my notes. It's a false doctrine that holds that basic freedoms cannot be achieved without economic and social rights. It is a tool to promote the equality of rights. It is a key element of the current human rights dogma. And no one seems to care that it makes no sense at all. Look at China. China has improved its standard of living Have their freedoms improved? The opposite. Freedoms are going down in China. And another thing is that at the Vienna meeting, this is kind of interesting, that this is where the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was established. And of course, the guy that was in charge of figuring out how it worked became the High Commissioner. And if you look at the job description of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, well, it's not so much about protecting human rights, it's about upholding the doctrine of indivisibility. And so when you listen to the High Commissioner today, especially the previous one, Navi Pillay, all she does is thump on indivisibility and dump on countries which she thinks weren't promoting economic and social rights. Extremely political speeches made by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and talking about things like, our goal is substantive equality of people. I mean, this is what the Soviets said, purely. Substantive equality. Okay, now I can understand equality of opportunity as a human rights objective, but substantive equality, this means ensuring that everybody has no more than anybody else. And it's in this is, you know, a tremendous threat to human rights. But what we have now today in the international list, we have the proliferation of human rights law. We have more and more economic and social rights provisions being inserted into treaties, and we have new collective rights treaties in the pipeline. There's a treaty on the rights of the elderly that has very likely to be come into force. And if you look at well, how did this happen? Okay, some countries, some Latin American countries have been promoting this for some time, but it's been powered by lobbies of different kinds, lobbies who want who provide care to the elderly, and they want very rigorous standards inserted into this treaty, which will make the kind of services that they provide legally binding. So this is functioning basically as a regulation. If you look at the you know, the theory concerning, you know, regulation, you find it acted out with regard to UN human rights treaties. So it's lobbyists, it's lawyers. Lawyers love treaties, they love rules, they love courts, they love everything where they have job opportunities. And the ABA has been a major promoter of this treaty and other treaties, I believe. And even though in the 50s the ABA was a tremendous critic of international law and of the UN, and especially with regard to human rights. And you know that they said, well, Frank Holman, who was the president of the ABA, would say, this is going to promote communism, you know. But it's a different story today. And the other people who are pushing for the treaty are the UN officials. So you have you know, and I think this is something fundamentally wrong. They should be neutral on a question like that. This is a matter for states, but UN officials are in there pressuring for the promulgation of this treaty. Why? Well, it gives them another treaty to oversee. It expands their bureaucracy. It expands their money and their power. And the UN officials are saying that, you know, there's a tremendous gap in the legislation, and it's our moral obligation to close that gap. And just one more thing about this that I uncovered, and which I put in my book, an internal confidential, not so confidential, but a confidential document from the European Union officials about the new treaty. And it said, we don't like the treaty. We think it's duplicative. It's not necessary. These rights are covered in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. but we can't stop it. We don't think we can stand up to this because the lobby is too strong, and really what this is kind of sad. Because they don't have the ideas to stand up to it. They can't defend opposition to this treaty, and any such treaty, economic and social rights treaty, if you oppose it, say, well, you don't care. You don't care about the elderly. You don't care about these things, And believe me, I've been told that a few times. And I think I probably have been talking quite a while, but let me just finish by talking about how human rights violate natural rights. And the real thing here is that at this Vienna meeting, which I mentioned, suddenly tolerance and combating xenophobia and things like that became human rights concerns. There's no question that intolerance is a factor in human rights violations, but we're talking now about civil society. So human rights is about preventing states from impinging on our freedoms. But this is when we talk about something like tolerance or intolerance and xenophobia, these are problems of people. These are problems of civilians. So that the human rights community is now starting to come down on civil society. The human rights community is part of civil society, and it's using the human rights machinery to oppose viewpoints that they don't like and call them human rights violations. And this is why you have the hate speech issue today. The international legislation is very faulty with regard to hate speech because despite the efforts of most liberal democracies, the communist countries and authoritarian countries were successful in inserting into Article 20 of the ICCPR that something that is essentially a hate speech legislation, something like incitement to hatred. What is incitement to hatred? It's a very vague term, which can be used by anybody that doesn't like what you're saying. You can say, well, that's incitement to hatred, incitement to discrimination, and other treaties can, like the Treaty on Racism, that's incitement to discrimination or incitement to racism. So you could say, I'm doing that right now. What I'm saying right now, I could go to jail for in a European country. They all have hate speech laws. So I'll say it here, but I won't say it when I go home. But and another thing, they talked about at the Vienna meeting was non-state actors as violating human rights. So this became a kind of accepted falsehood that non-state actors can be guilty of violating human rights. And this is where you have this treaty now, it's another treaty that's in the pipeline against business corporations, a treaty to regulate international business corporations. Well, I don't think business corporations violate human rights. They may break laws, and they should be prosecuted for breaking laws. But this is not the same as violating human rights. And this will pass. This treaty has got a lot of legs to it, and it's even opposed by the person that started the whole business in human rights campaign. And I'll just end by saying that I'm worried, very worried about the idea of human rights, because I don't think in its currently sort of gutted form that it is a very strong moral idea that can help us stand up to the factors in the world today which are threatening human rights. It's not a coincidence that since the idea of human rights became so expansive, the actual enjoyment of human rights has declined since the mid-90s. And we see today movements, political movements, essentially fascistic movements and nationalistic movements in the form of Islamist politics, in the form of the Chinese approach to human rights, and in the form of the Russian version of human rights, which aims at protecting spiritual security and censoring anything that would disturb adherence to the Russian Orthodox Church. And all of these things, in a creepy way, resemble what's going on in international human rights. And so there's a kind of convergence going on, and that's why I named this final chapter in the book as A Convergence Against Liberty. And I'm going to stop there, and we would be glad to try to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rhodes. And I read an article not too long ago in the New Republic. It was called Dictators Love Development Statistics. And the reason why they love development statistics is because they can always point to something where they're succeeding. You know, if you burrow down far enough and if you manipulate the numbers far enough, you can always point to progress in one way or another. And it serves to distract critics or criticism of their practices or of their policies away from what they're doing to their populations in terms of other areas, because they can say, well, yeah, maybe, but look over here. And I think what we're seeing on human rights is very representative of that. And I was curious if you could maybe provide a few examples of how human rights groups themselves have become captured by this. And I'm reminded of a debate I had in a different context, the International Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, and in there we were doing a privatization of ICANN to get government to end the U.S. contractual relationship with it. But in so doing, the civil society groups wanted to make sure there were human rights protections inside of ICANN. And this was a big debate because it was a corporation, and corporations don't have the same responsibilities that states do in terms of human rights. But in a large part of the debate was about, well, what could ICANN really do within its mandate to affect human rights? And my suggestion was, let's focus on what ICANN actually does in terms of content, freedom of expression, that sort of thing. And the human rights groups recoiled in horror from this, because you can't break apart human rights. So just as much as ICANN has maybe some potential impact in terms of freedom of expression, it must also, by definition, have just as much role in the right to food or the right to rent control or whatever it is that comes up. And when you raise the very reasonable point that ICANN has nothing to do with provision of food, or ICANN has nothing to do with rent, no. They're indivisible. They're interrelated, they're interdependent, and they're all equal. You can't treat them separately one from the other. And this, to me, seems to have become embedded in the psyche and in the philosophy of everybody from Amnesty International to Human Rights Campaign to others. And I think it is detrimental because not every human right is the same. Not every human rights situation requires every human rights situation to be dealt with equivalently and across the board. And I think it serves as it undermines our effort to actually truly address awful human rights situations around the world. And I wonder if you could talk about how human rights groups arrived at this point, and maybe what could be done about it to actually get them back onto the track that we think they should be on. And then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Well, it's complicated. The one factor is that, okay, how did we get here? and one of the reasons, I don't blame human rights groups, and I think we have to be careful about dumping on human rights groups. Amnesty International has a reputation of being a leftist human rights group. But if you look at the reports they actually write, they don't write very many reports about economic and social rights at all. It's mainly sort of a platform for political rhetoric by their leaders. But when they get down to, when you look at their actual work, they find they can't really get their teeth into economic and social rights, and they produce a lot of very good reports about torture, freedom of expression, freedom of association, these basic things. And when I want to know a fact about one of these questions, I always pull up the Amnesty report. The documentation is so precise, and they're so careful that you can rely on them saying these things. But the fact is that Amnesty has changed its mandate, and there was a tremendous fight inside the organization, a fight that lasted for 15 years or something like that about this. And the old crowd wanted to stick with their original mandate, and then they had a lot of leftists coming into the organization that wanted to change it. And after the fall of the communist countries, all the peace proponents, the members of all these peace groups in Europe, maybe in America too, they didn't have anything to do anymore. And they joined human rights groups, and they called what they were doing human rights. And so this is another factor, this sort of a demographic factor, that human rights became a kind of platform for a very diverse group of activists, along with the expanded definition of human rights. And these things kind of went together. The human rights groups had a very big impact on the Vienna meeting. And the preparation for this meeting involved hundreds of NGOs from different regions that came and pressured the delegates to do things. And unfortunately, our government did almost nothing at that time. They made no proposals, and they did nothing to stop this butchering of the idea of human rights. I think today, that Brett is right that that this interconnectedness. This is a kind of shows you that human rights are not something that's liberating people today. Human rights is something that's hemming people in. You can't do anything without violating a human right, and so as they're defined, and human rights is very often associated, and rightly, with global governance campaigns. And of course, this is turning off a lot of people. And unfortunately, and I think it's especially unfortunate that it's turning off a lot of conservatives, that human rights has become so ideological that a lot of conservatives have just given up on human rights. And one of the things I hope to do with my book is to interest conservatives in human rights again, and to get and to inspire the development of a human rights approach which is consistent with classical liberalism, and to give it more force.
Thank you. Is anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question? Gentlemen? Please identify yourself and
Sure.
ask a question, please.
Chris Unger, I'm a private practicing physician here in the Washington area. I also am a GW faculty member. I would like to ask both of you whether you have seen the horrible carnage that was reported in previous years in the Middle East. I'm speaking specifically about beheadings. Is the incidence of that going down in the past year?
Thank you.
I don't know. I don't keep statistics on beheadings myself. I haven't heard about too many recently, but I'm not the right person to answer that question, I think. I could maybe try to help you find somebody like that, but if you want to see me afterwards. But I think that maybe online you can look it up.
Yeah.
I'm Deborah Weiss from Center for Security Policy. Given the fact that the UN Declaration of Human Rights has those clauses in it that you referenced, which are basically advocating for social economic rights and also the clauses on the hate speech. Do you think it's time for us to rewrite that? Like, how would we overcome that? I have heard other places criticize America because we don't have enough human rights, because we believe in freedom from government, and a lot of those clauses, as you pointed out, are mandates to have more government.
You know, it's just this is a very fundamental problem, because the foundation of our human rights system is faulty. And when you criticize it, it's a kind of heresy. It's like criticizing the Ten Commandments. And I don't have any doubt myself that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been an inspiration for many people, and it's been a threat to dictators around the world. And I have friends in Uzbekistan who got in jail because they found copies of this in their possession. But at the same time, it's not a law. It's a set of principles. And so there's flexibility in the way it can be interpreted. And you know, it's possible to simply ignore economic and social rights, not promote them, criticize them, and focus on freedom, focus on protecting basic freedoms, and to call out the exploitation and the betrayal of human rights when it happens. And I think that's probably the best way to approach this. When we there's a fundamental principle of the rule of law. You don't cherry pick laws. And that's the problem with our international human rights system of laws, is that so many of them make no sense. And this is a dilemma for law-abiding people and for people who promote the rule of law. And I'm really not sure how to get around this, but I think the problem is going to solve itself in a few decades, because the international human rights system is becoming more and more thin and weak, and non-compliance with human rights is on the rise. Even European countries aren't complying with the European Convention on Human Rights, with rulings of the European Court. And if you look at the statistics on this, even the most democratic, I'm not talking about Romania or Georgia or a country like that. They never comply with the European Convention, or Russia. But even Western European democracies aren't complying with these rulings, and gradually we're going to have to find a way to protect natural rights outside of this system.
Adam Brickley, I work here at Heritage. I was wondering if you'd comment on something I've been seeing more, at least in the debate here in the U.S., and I'm assuming in other Western countries in the last couple of years when human rights comes up, which is not just the expansion of the idea of human rights, but the idea that if certain people broach the idea of human rights that are from a privileged class or because they're Westerners, that they have, that even broaching the subject is somehow a theft of another person's culture or an act of colonization and oppression, and that therefore they have a moral responsibility not just to accept the expanded definition, but to shut up, so that even broaching it is an act of oppression, and whether that view is becoming more prominent and whether it's causing problems.
Well, I think it is becoming more prominent, and this is part of the dynamic of new human rights. And when you follow the statements and the publications of the advocates of the various new human rights, it's extremely cynical. First of all, you find that they fully accept the idea that human rights is a kind of way of politics. Human rights is nothing but politics, what they say. It's a little bit like people who say that constitutional rights are nothing but politics, that they're there to protect certain classes of people, and that the necessity in America is to sort of overcome constitutional rights in order to have progress. Well, it's the same thing going on there. And they very often say that, well, civil and political rights, those are your rights. I want my own rights. As if they don't enjoy civil and political rights. So civil and political rights are considered sort of the rights of the old white males, and so on. And I mean, this is just a disaster, and it shows you how derisory our understanding of human rights has become. I hope I answered your question. I made a statement, I think.
I'll ask one final question, and that is, we're increasingly seeing efforts to try and, you mentioned this at the very end, identify specific groups, individuals as having separate rights agendas, whether that be children's rights or women's rights or sexual orientation, gender identity, all these different types of sort of group rights. And the idea behind them is that human rights are insufficient to cover these individual groups. And how would you address those types of complaints and concerns by those groups to say that we're not covered or sufficiently covered or addressed in terms of our rights under the broader umbrella of human rights?
I think that's a really good question, and a way that when I go back to my own practice in human rights, that in the Helsinki Federation we organized the first really major project on women's rights in the region, and I don't think anybody involved thought that there was any difference between women's rights and human rights. Women just needed help to ensure that their human rights were respected. And I think this is the answer, that there are vulnerable groups in society who suffer human rights violations, and we have to focus on their group, on them as individuals, to ensure that authorities respect their human rights, and to ensure that discrimination doesn't play a role in the equal treatment before the law. And all of their rights should be protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the interpretation of that covenant, you have to look very closely on that to make sure that they're doing their job. And generally they do a good job, by the way. I think it's the bright part in the whole UN system. But I think that focusing on this fundamental treaty and bringing those concerns into that treaty body and into promoting compliance with that treaty is the way to go.
Sure, one final question.
I'm still debating. I actually attended a panel somewhere else and went to great pains to get there on free speech, because that's something that I'm very focused on, and was completely shocked that the entire panel consisted of basically them trying to shut Trump up. It was a Trump bashing festival, and they were, in my opinion, incorrectly saying that he was threatening free speech because, according to them, he kept saying the media is the enemy, which is not what he said. He said the fake news media is the enemy. And I'm just wondering, I haven't been able to figure out how across this country, and according to what you're saying, across many countries, the inverse of the word is really being used. So, free speech is hate. I mean, I was interested in networking. I wouldn't want to work for any of those places now, because the free speech advocates are advocating for censorship. And it seems to be happening on a lot of different topics. And if it's happening all over, like, what is the source of it? Do you think that it might be partly a gradual dissociation from our Judeo-Christian values, which advocate for individual responsibility?
I don't know about what the last part you said. That's a little bit heavy for me. But I think, like I said, I think this all started first of all with this political failure in the drafting of the article of the covenant, and a lot of the countries that opposed putting this vague hate speech language into international law at that time now promote it. You're right, you know, and this is terrifying. The human rights community is campaigning for restrictions on free speech, and you know, cops and robbers are a tough combination to protect yourself from, and this has broader cultural and political implications. And to me, it represents a kind of increasing kind of conformism in society, political correctness, and fear of kind of standing out, and people people need to have courage to stand out, and all good ideas were at one point odd ideas, and I don't know really what I can say to your point beyond the fact that we have to have in this society a kind of counter-revolution in human rights where we object to that interpretation of human rights and show what's wrong with it in a very civil way, not in a way that disrespects our fellow citizens for what we disagree with, but in an appeal to rationality, which is difficult because rationality is considered something old-fashioned. But human rights, in my study of human rights and of natural rights, and of the basis, the fundamental building blocks of human rights came to us from John Locke and also from Immanuel Kant, who said that human rights depends on rationality, and in order to protect rationality, we have to use rationality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rhodes, and for coming here and talking about your book today. There are some copies available in the lobby if you'd like to purchase one. I think it's a very, very timely topic today when we're constantly facing challenges to some basic fundamental rights from people who don't want to be offended or don't want to be confronted with ideas that they disagree with. And I think we need to be having that conversation and that back and forth more than ever today. Thank you very much.